They said Stillwater was the kind of town where nothing truly dark ever lasted. A place where faces were familiar, doors stayed unlocked, and justice was something everyone still believed in. But one autumn morning, that belief cracked. A name hit the courthouse steps like a match dropped in dry grass: Jason Butler. 17, bright, athletic, a face once framed by school trophies and family photographs. Within days, that same face became a symbol of something else: privilege without consequence. It started quietly, a whisper through the hallways, a headline no one wanted to read. Then the whisper became a storm: arrest, charges, the words no one could reconcile with the image they knew. Assault, coercion, violation. The town gasped. The courtroom filled. Cameras blinked like mechanical eyes hungry for meaning. Yet under the noise, a quieter tension pulsed the question that would haunt every conversation afterward: who does the law really serve? Jason Butler's story wasn't the first of its kind, but in Stillwater, it felt like a betrayal. Here was a young man accused of crimes that left lasting scars, and yet by the time the verdict was read, it seemed deep and touched by mercy the rest of town couldn't define in their own lives. The judge's gavel fell softly, almost apologetically, and the sentence that followed was not what the community expected. No prison, no long years behind bars. Instead, rehabilitation, supervision, youthful offender status. Words that sounded clinical, even hopeful, until you realized what they meant: freedom where others had found none. At first, people thought they'd misheard. A suspended sentence for violent crimes? The town that raised Jason Butler erupted. The courthouse steps flooded with signs and voices. Justice for all. Accountability isn't optional. But the courthouse remained quiet. The decision had been made. The law followed, the reasoning written neatly in legal ink. He was young, capable of reform, deserving of another chance. And yet, to those who watched from the outside, it felt like the scales of justice had tilted toward one man's last name. The protests grew. Local mothers came out with photos of sons who had faced harsher penalties for lesser crimes. A retired teacher shook her head and said softly into a microphone, "If his name wasn't Butler, would this even be a discussion?" The question didn't need an answer. Everyone already knew it. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the statute that made it possible, the Youthful Offender Act. It was designed to give young defendants a second chance to recognize that adolescents can change, that their mistakes need not define their futures. The law assumes good faith, equity, and a belief in rehabilitation over punishment. But in Stillwater, those noble intentions collided with a different reality: selective mercy. The law, as applied, became less about what was fair and more about who fit its narrative of redeemability. Jason Butler fit that narrative perfectly. He came from a family with connections, his father a well-known businessman, his mother active in civic groups. His lawyer was respected, eloquent, persuasive. And when the sentencing hearing arrived, the courtroom turned into theater. The defense painted Jason as remorseful, misunderstood, the product of youthful error, not malice. They spoke of grades, community service, future potential. The victim's statements trembled in the air, their pain palpable, but somehow the system's sympathy leaned the other way. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was steady. Given the defendant's age and pursuant to statute, the court finds it appropriate to apply youthful offender consideration. The words hung like frost in the air. Just like that, A lifetime of accountability dissolved into conditional freedom. Outside, the sky dimmed early that evening. The courthouse lights stayed on as the crowd chanted into dusk. "Equal justice under law," someone shouted. "Then make it equal," another answered. Reporters circled, capturing tears and fury. Parents clutched their children's hands tighter. They weren't protesting Jason Butler alone. They were protesting what he represented, the soft edges of a system that seemed to harden only for certain people. Over the weeks that followed, Stillwater split in two. Some said mercy was the mark of a civilized society. Others said mercy without equality was its undoing. Old friends stopped speaking. Teachers debated in classrooms. Church sermons tiptoed around the topic. Everyone had an opinion. No one had peace. The Butler family retreated from view. Jason was required to attend counseling, avoid social media, stay home by curfew. But to the town, it felt symbolic restrictions that cost little. "He gets to live his life," one woman said bitterly. "My daughter doesn't get hers back." The case became national news for a moment, the kind that flares brightly and fades quickly. But in Stillwater, the embers didn't fade. They smoldered, quietly feeding on every story of disparity that came next. A boy from the South End arrested for shoplifting, sentenced to 9 months. A girl expelled for fighting back against harassment. Ordinary kids paying heavy prices while the privileged walked free. "Justice," someone murmured at the diner one night, "is a currency. Some people are just born rich, and that's the heart of it, the part the cameras never capture. Selective justice doesn't announce itself. It seeps quietly into rulings, policies, and polite justifications. It hides behind legal phrasing like in the best interests of the defendant or the potential for rehabilitation. But every time it's applied unequally, it whispers a dangerous truth. Not all lives carry the same weight in the balance. Stillwater's residents began to keep mental lists, comparisons of who got what from the system. A teenager from a poorer district sentenced as an adult. A privileged one shielded under youthful offender statutes. The law's letter stayed the same, but its spirit was cracked. Even those who had once defended the ruling began to feel uneasy. Because when mercy starts to look like favoritism, faith in justice becomes hard to defend. Months later, the protests quieted, but the unease never left. The courthouse lawn grew its grass back. The headlines moved on. But in living rooms and classrooms, people still talked about that day. They talked about how the judge's voice trembled slightly before she said, "Suspended sentence." They remembered how the mother of one victim wept, not from surprise, but from confirmation that what she feared was true all along. Justice might wear a blindfold, but sometimes she peeks. Jason Butler's life went on, though not unmarked. The conditions of his freedom were strict, his every move monitored. Yet even that became part of the town's bitterness. "They call it supervision," a man at the grocery store said, "but it looks like a second chance. My nephew never got one." For some, Jason was a reminder of everything wrong with the system. For others, he was its cautionary example, a boy turned symbol, trapped by a story larger than himself. The truth lay somewhere in between, but by then, truth mattered less than what people believed. And belief is what truly governs justice. Laws are written by humans, interpreted by humans, and lived by humans. If the people stop believing those laws are fair, the structure itself begins to shake. Stillwater was shaking. One evening, the town held a forum at the Civic Center. Citizens, lawyers, and advocates gathered under fluorescent lights to talk about reform. "This isn't just about one boy," a speaker said. "It's about a system that doesn't see evenly." Applause broke out, then silence, as an elderly man stood and asked a question that no one could quite answer. How do we fix something built to favor the favored? Number one knew, but the asking of it mattered. The conversation had begun. As months turned into a year, the town's anger transformed into activism. Petitions circulated. A local journalist began a series called Scales Tilted, Stories of Unequal Justice. Law students from a nearby university came to study the case, calling it a modern parable of procedural fairness versus social bias. National outlets briefly revisited the story, quoting officials who insisted everything had been done by the book. And perhaps it had. But Stillwater's book, it seemed, was missing a few chapters. Meanwhile, behind the quiet of his monitored life, Jason Butler himself wrestled with shadows. Freedom, after all, can feel heavy when carried under scrutiny. He walked the narrow lanes of his neighborhood with eyes that met few others. He heard whispers in grocery aisles, saw petitions with his name blurred out but recognizable. Guilt is a peculiar thing. It doesn't always come from conviction. Sometimes it comes from grace that feels undeserved. Whether he changed, only time would tell. But what mattered most was what Stillwater changed into. Trust had been wounded. Young people looked at their courts differently. Parents warned their children not only about wrongdoing, but about expectations, about the truth that fairness was something you had to demand, not assume. The story of Jason Butler didn't end with the final sentence. It ended with a comma, a pause in a larger narrative that stretched beyond Stillwater into the country's conscience. Because every town has its version of this story, a place where someone walked free while another bore the weight. And every time it happens, the question rises again. How blind is justice when she keeps recognizing familiar faces? By the time spring returned, a mural had appeared downtown. It wasn't sanctioned. Painted in grayscale, it showed the scales of justice cracked down the middle, one side heavier than the other. Beneath it, someone had written, "Balance is not equality." The town didn't remove it. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they shouldn't. Then something unexpected happened. One of the local activists received a call from a neighboring county, a mother there, with a story eerily similar to Stillwater's. Different town, same law, same result. The mother's voice trembled as she said, "It's happening here too." That call would become the seed of a larger movement, the spark for what would later be known as the Equal Scales Initiative. It started as a Facebook group, then a petition, then a coalition of towns comparing their stories, finding patterns where officials had sworn there were none. And as the movement grew, so did the questions that even lawmakers couldn't ignore. How many times had this statute been used to spare the privileged? How often had mercy looked like discrimination in disguise? The questions moved from social media to state houses. Senators cited Stillwater in debates. Commentators called it the small town that exposed a national flaw. But for those who lived it, those debates felt late, almost hollow. Justice delayed, as they knew too well, was justice deferred. Through it all, the town carried a strange mix of pride and pain. They had demanded accountability, but what they uncovered was larger than any one verdict. It was a mirror held up to the nation. Stillwater had become a synonym for disparity, a byword for imbalance. Yet within that discomfort, something vital had stirred. Awareness, conversation, the courage to ask who gets saved and who gets sentenced. And that's where this first chapter closes, not with closure, but with a reckoning. Because justice is not a destination. It's a test taken daily by those entrusted to uphold it. Stillwater failed that test once, but maybe failure was what it took for people to start rewriting the rules. They say every courtroom has two trials, one in law and one in public opinion. Jason Butler was acquitted in one and convicted in the other. But the third trial, the one that matters most, is the one still ongoing, the trial of the system itself. The courthouse stands the same as it always has, white stone against a restless sky. But inside, whispers have changed. New judges speak differently, reporters linger longer. And somewhere, someone is watching this story unfold and asking, what if it happens again? Because it will. Somewhere, another young defendant will face the same choice. Another courtroom will balance reputation against retribution, and another community will ask whether justice truly means the same thing for everyone. In Stillwater, the echoes remain. The name Butler fades, but the symbol endures, a reminder that fairness cannot exist where privilege dictates mercy. The scales may tilt again, but this time the world is watching. And as one of the activists said during a late-night interview that aired months later, we didn't lose faith in justice that day. We lost faith in who was holding the scales. The story of Stillwater is not just about what happened. It's about what we allow to keep happening. And the next time the law decides who deserves redemption, the question won't be, why him? But why not everyone? This is the story of Jason Butler, the case that shook Stillwater. But the tremor didn't stop there. It's still moving quietly toward another town, another courtroom, another test. Because justice, when cracked, doesn't collapse, it echoes. And if you listen closely, that echo leads to the next chapter, the law itself. The same statute that spared Jason Butler is now under review. Lawmakers are split, lawyers divided, and families demanding answers. Episode 2 will take us there, to the heart of that law. The law that protects and the law that fails.